Hello, I'm Katie Lloyd-Nunn. I'm the Programme Manager at Hawkwood Centre for Future Thinking. And I have invited Mary Reynolds Thompson to one of our Conversations That Matter. Mary is originally from England and now based in California, and she's a writer and a poetry teacher. She began her career in copywriting and branding and would search the dictionaries for words that would sell anything from cosmetics to cars. But in 2000, you had a moment when you realised that you were going to use language in a more sacred way. Could you tell me about that, Mary?
Yeah, I'd love to, Katie. It was actually 2001, so yes, the early 2000s. And after the devastation of the collapse of the World Trade Centers under the attack, and I think the lives of many of us changed in that moment. And for me, the collapse of those towers was such a metaphor for really the collapse of our financial systems, but also in a strange way, a kind of Western way of living. And, you know, I had been using my talent, my love of language, my love of myth and iconography and all of these things to sell more stuff to people. And I was part of the problem. And there was this horrible moment when I woke up and I realized that all my creative talent was going to create more consumers. But I didn't know what to do. I knew I loved language. I knew deeply in my heart that I had an incredible connection to the natural world, and I didn't know more than that. And then in the way of the world, I stumbled upon poetry therapy. Accidentally, I heard a woman speak, and she was a poetry therapist, and it was like Kundalini energy just running through my body. And I thought, that's what I want to do. That was for me, the poetry was the portal into using language in a sacred way.
Good, so poetry seems like you made the gesture of Kundalini rising, so something started to arise in and through you. How would you describe that?
Well, you know, for me, it was immediately I was drawn to the nature poets. People like Wendell Berry and William Stafford and Joy Harjo and Linda Hogan and the divine Mary Oliver, many of the people listening will know. But what they did was their eyes focused on the natural world outside, but they always returned us to our inner world. And that Kundalini kind of frisson that I felt was this beginning to see the dance between inner and outer nature. Because even though, as I said, their poetry describes so beautifully the natural world about us, they always, like the great Mary Oliver saying, you know, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? They always left me with this yearning question to know what I wanted to do with my own wild soul.
And what did you do then? Did you travel when this invitation came into your life?
Well, you know, I'd been blessed in my life to have traveled quite a few places, and I had already been a sort of avid mountain climber, you know, not technical, just schlepping up big hills and deep landscapes. But no, I took a 2-year training is what I did, and I read vociferously, and what I also did was made poetry part of my daily practice. And I would take poems out into nature and I would speak them to the trees and the skies and the bird. And so poetry to me became utterly inseparable from the natural world. And so in a way, I don't think I traveled more or less. What I would say is I traveled more deeply into wherever it is I was. And that language became, for me, that bridge where I began to be more deeply in conversation with the world around me.
And for some people, poetry is like a frightening, not frightening, but an unsettling word. They think, oh, I couldn't be a poet, or I don't write poetry. But my little experience of working with you is you have a very inviting approach. It's quite simple. How would you describe your approach to poetry or poetry therapy or wild therapy?
Right. Well, I think most of the people who come to me are actually recovering poets. They were wounded in school. We went to school and some English teacher presented us with a poem that was completely incomprehensible, which made reference to gods and goddesses that we didn't know who they were, and to historical references. And so poems were impermeable. We couldn't find our way into them, and we went, poetry isn't for me. And yet children are natural poets. Children are constantly coming up with metaphors and nature metaphors, so it's innate in us. We all have this capacity to write poetry. So the people often who come to me still have that little reverberation of, oh yes, I can write poetry, but they've been a little wounded. So what I learned to do is the poetry you select to bring forth other people's poetry has to be like the poetry of Wendell Berry and Mary Oliver, easy to access. You know, we all understand it's written in language that we can comprehend. It's not intimidating. It doesn't have words or references in it that kind of pushes out and away. And also, the world itself is the primary text. So you can read the landscape as a poem. And when people go out there and see how they can just engage with some gorgeous wild tree or being or bird, and that in itself is a moment of poetry that they can begin to write about. And it's almost inevitable when you write about poetry, when you write about nature, that it will become lyrical and poetic. Even people go, oh, I never write poetry. That's poetry. You've just written poetry. Yeah.
And you're here at the Centre for Future Thinking. So how do you think this can draw us into a positive future, this approach?
Yeah, I just want to actually take a breath into that question because it's such a big question. I believe that poetry is language rewilded. And as you know, my great passion in life is connecting us to what is wild. And I think for so many of us, we've been used to speaking about our lives and focusing on our lives in such a rational, hypermasculine, reasonable way, or black and white, this or that. Poetry holds paradox. It holds wildness. It holds the breath of wildness in it. You never know when you're engaged in poetry what's going to emerge. And so there's something utterly surprising about the craft of writing poetry. And why that's important is we are in the midst of telling a story about this world that is linear and logical, and it's headed to no place good. We know this, we feel it. Already we've reached the part in the narrative where we're terrified of the ending, right? We're terrified of it. Poetry allows us to kind of interject, immerse ourselves into that scary place in the narrative. Hold the darkness and the light and begin a conversation that is open to possibilities we haven't yet even considered.
You know, I think that's a wonderful place to stop because there's a sense of future possibility.
Yes.
So thank you so much, Mary.
Thank you, Katie.